Hi everyone, I'm going to show you how to take your granny square when you finish it with these tail ends hanging out to something where they're completely invisible and they've disappeared, but that your granny square is nice and strong and secure. So I'm going to show you how to weave in those ends so they become invisible. To do that, you're going to need an embroidery needle or darning needle, depending what you like to call them. I like to keep a little collection of metal tipped ones. I find them easier to work with. And you want to make sure they have a large eye, that's this part here, because the wool is, your yarn is quite thick and it needs to be big enough to weave through, to feed through the eye of your needle. Okay, let's get started. You're going to need some scissors to cut your yarn. I really like to use embroidery scissors because they have a very narrow pointed end and it makes it much easier to work with small detail on your crochet work. So when you want to sew in your ends, you usually, when you're working with granny squares with just one colour, you usually have two ends, the beginning and the end. So I like to pull this starting thread tight. And the reason for that is if we flip it over, you can see it'll help to close that center hole really, really tight. And I'm pulling quite hard on that and it'll close it for us to give a nice tight finish here at the center of our granny square. And then I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to take my yarn. I like to roll the end. If you find that you've got little fluffy bits or bits of thread at the end of it, I snip it just to give a clean edge, and I'm going to roll that thread, your yarn, I'm going to roll it so it tightens it slightly, makes it nice and compact and easier to thread through the eye of our needle. And then you just pull it through and you're ready to go. Now you can see where it starts there, and I'm going to turn it and I'm going to start by weaving that under these tight stitches at the beginning of our granny square, and I'm going to push the yarn and pull it through, pull it nice and tight, and then I'm going to go back in the opposite direction. I'm actually going to make sure that I pierce the wool as well, not just weave under it, but go through the yarn itself as I weave backwards. And then for extra security, I'm going to go right across, pushing through the yarn in different directions. Really makes this anchored it in and very secure. And I'm really pulling very hard on that. And because I don't want to risk those ever coming open, especially if they go in the washing machine, I'm pulling back through one more time for luck. And you can see that's completely secure now. And I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to snip very, very close to that base. Just give it a little press. And you can see that that has, almost by magic, completely disappeared now, but it's really secure, it's really anchored in, and you can't see any evidence that there was ever a tail there. And now we're going to go to the corner and we're going to do the same thing with this final tail here. So we get our embroidery needle and I'm going to just wind the top end of it, see if that will weave through. Hurrah, yes it will. Just pull that through the eye of the needle. And I like to make sure that I'm working at the back. And then I'm going to turn this around and bring this up really close so you can see what I'm doing. Here's the knot where we finished. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pierce that. Well, can you see I'm going through it, not just under it. And I'm going to weave in and out of the yarn. So I'm piercing the threads of the yarn. And I'm going to pull back here, pull it through. Just lost it. I'm going to rethread that. Don't worry, it does happen. So just push that through the eye of the needle. Now I'm going to go back on myself. I'm going to go back through those stitches I just wove through, pulling quite tight, and you can see that it starts to kind of lock in on itself. And coming back in the opposite direction. Again, I've pierced the wool every time. And now that I'm really anchored in, I'm going to go through and move away from the top there and hide it underneath some of these other stitches. Get moving in different directions each time that I put the needle back through the yarn, and just push it through. It'll glide through quite easily with these nice metallic needles. And then one more for luck, again, piercing the yarn each time. And then I like to, for the finals, just go under a little cluster here of stitches, because I know that when I cut it, then it'll just disappear underneath. So I've pulled that through nice and tight. Now remember, the trick is to pull it up quite tightly. I'm holding it in place while I get my scissors. And then I'm just, for the purposes of this, so you can see, I wouldn't normally do it this way, but just so you can see how close that I get. Being careful not to cut anything else except that thread, and then snip. And then just give it a little wiggle, and it will have completely disappeared. And that is how we completely weave in our threads so they disappear and that they're completely secure. And make sure that they're woven and really secure so they don't come out, especially if we're going to pop it in the washing machine. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. If you want to learn how to make this granny square, there's another video on my channel that will show you how to do that. And if you want the blanket, there's a pattern in the description for you. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. Happy crocheting.